A soft wind swept through Central Park, stirring golden leaves across the cobblestone paths like nature's whisper of change. The sun, veiled behind a gentle curtain of clouds, filtered through the thinning canopy, casting long, melancholic shadows on the ground. It was the kind of afternoon that made New Yorkers slow down, not out of fatigue, but from a quiet longing they couldn't quite name. The kind of afternoon where memories rise uninvited and hearts feel a little more exposed. Near the western edge of the park, where the benches rarely caught the afternoon sun, and tourists seldom wandered, two boys sat huddled on the cold iron slats of a weathered bench. They were twins, though at a glance you wouldn't immediately know it. One, Tommy, held himself with a silent resolve, shoulders tense, eyes darting from passerby to passerby. The other, Danny, sat close, his expression softer, still tinted, with the innocence that hardship hadn't yet erased. They were only 9, but they carried the silence of children who had grown up too fast. Between them sat a small red toy car, wooden, worn, the paint chipped in patches where time and tiny hands had rubbed it bare. It looked out of place, like a piece of the past awkwardly left in the present. And in a way, it had been their father's last gift before a sudden illness took him away 2 years ago. It wasn't just a toy. It was the last bridge to someone who had once made their small world feel safe. Tommy, ... Do you think someone will buy it? Danny's voice was barely louder than the wind, and it trembled. Not just from the autumn chill, but from the kind of hunger and fear that children should never have to know. They had eaten nothing since morning. Their mother, Margaret, had fallen sick again. The heart condition she'd long battled had taken a sharp turn. She lay in their cramped apartment in Brooklyn, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. The doctor had warned they needed medicine immediately, or they could lose her, but medicine costs money. And money was something they no longer had. Tommy didn't answer right away. He just looked out across the path, watching a jogger blur past, then a young couple pushing a stroller. None of them noticed the boys. None of them even slowed down. Someone will, he finally whispered. They have to. For all his composure, Tommy's grip on the car betrayed him. His fingers clenched too tight, knuckles white. That car, that memory, was the last thing they had. And he was about to let it go for a chance, just a chance to keep their mother alive. People passed. Some glanced, most didn't. A few slowed, curiosity piqued by the boy's stillness. One woman asked about the car, but when Tommy explained it was handmade, old, scratched, not battery-operated, she offered a polite smile and walked on. Another man in a business suit looked for all of 2 seconds before muttering no thanks, and quickening his pace. Most just ignored them altogether, as if they were invisible. Each rejection felt like a slow unraveling. With every passing minute, the sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew longer. The air became sharper. Danny shivered, hugging his knees to his chest. What if nobody buys it? He asked. This time his voice cracked. Tommy didn't respond. He couldn't. There's a particular kind of desperation that settles in when a child realizes the world isn't going to come to their rescue. Not today, not soon enough. Then a black Bentley pulled to a slow, silent stop just across the path. The vehicle was sleek, its paint so polished it reflected the bare trees like a mirror. Out stepped a man, tall, imposing, draped in a charcoal gray overcoat, over an impeccably tailored suit. His hair was silver at the temples, his expression unreadable behind dark, rimless glasses. He looked like someone who owned the building you worked in, or maybe all the buildings on the block. This was Mr. Jonathan Brooks, a real estate tycoon, known in business circles as much for his ruthless efficiency as for his complete detachment from anything emotional. His name appeared on Forbes lists. His face did not. He had come to the park for an odd detour after a high-stakes board meeting that left him feeling unmoored. Maybe it was the changing season. Maybe the memory of something long buried. Either way, he walked alone now, past the vendors and saxophone players, until something caught his agile flash of red, scuffed and small, cradled between 2 boys. His steps slowed. The car, it was nearly identical to the one his daughter, his little Emily, used to carry everywhere before she passed away. He remembered the chipped red paint, the same carved wooden wheels, the way she would press it to her cheek when she slept. A dull ache began behind his ribcage, blooming like a bruise he hadn't felt in years. He stared. Tommy noticed first, instinctively pulling the car closer as the man approached. Danny followed suit, eyes wide. They'd never been this close to someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a movie, and certainly never someone who looked so Powerful. Mr. Brooks stopped in front of them. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked not at them, but at the car, the memory, the echo, and then, his voice, low, unfamiliar, even to himself. Are you boys selling that? Tommy stood, shaky but polite. Why yes, sir. Do you want it? The billionaire looked at the car, then at the boys. Their faces pale, eyes hollowed by hunger, hands red from the cold. He could have asked how much, he could have walked away, but something in him had already shifted. The wind picked up again, rattling the bare branches overhead. Behind them, the park carried on. Tourists snapped photos. Dogs barked. Somewhere, a street musician played yesterday on a violin. But here, on this forgotten bench, time paused. He reached for his wallet, and as he pulled out a stack of bills far beyond the car's worth, Tommy and Danny's world, so small, so fragile, began to change. Not yet knowing that the man standing before them wasn't just about to buy a broken toy, but about to buy back a piece of his soul. And as the sun disappeared beneath the city skyline, the real journey began. The cash felt strange in Tommy's hand, crisp, heavy, more than he had ever touched in his life. His fingers trembled as he took it, more out of disbelief than the cold. Danny looked up at him with round, questioning eyes, then down at the money, and back at the man who had handed it over without so much as a raised brow. Mr. Jonathan Brooks said nothing more, just took the toy car in both hands, slowly, reverently, as though it were made of porcelain and memory. His gaze lingered on the worn red paint, the dent on the left fender, the scuff marks on the bottom where countless playtimes had left their trace. He turned it gently, his thumbs brushing over the grooves left by a child's fingers long gone. Something about the moment felt sacred, like holding a relic of a past life. Not theirs. The twins bowed slightly, almost out of instinct, muttering quiet thank yous, and clutching the money like it was oxygen. Then, without looking back, they darted off, disappearing into the winding paths of Central Park as the shadows grew deeper and the streetlights began to flicker awake. But Mr. Brooks did not move. He stood there, utterly still, the toy car in hand, the soft rustle of leaves the only sound around him. Something had shifted in him. Not sharply, not violently, but undeniably. It was as if the air had cracked just wide enough to let in the scent of something long forgotten. He should have walked away, gone back to his Bentley, returned to his penthouse where silence ruled, where the art was expensive but lifeless, where his housekeeper spoke in whispers and never asked about the locked room at the end of the hallway. That was the rhythm of his life, controlled, quiet, devoid of detours. And yet, a tug, not physical, not logical, but visceral, like a thread inside his chest had been yanked by invisible hands. He turned toward his car. Follow them, he said, his voice low and deliberate. His driver, a man named Charles, blinked in surprise. Sir, just follow, he repeated. Keep your distance. I want to know where they go. Don't let them see you. Charles didn't argue. In over a decade of service, he had learned that when Jonathan Brooks issued a command, it wasn't open to interpretation. Still, something about this request felt different. Not calculated. Not strategic. Personal. Mr. Brooks got into the back seat, the toy car still in his hand. The Bentley hummed to life and rolled quietly into the New York dusk, its headlights casting pale cones onto the pavement. Inside, Mr. Brooks leaned back against the leather headrest, his fingers tightening around the wooden toy as the city passed by, in streaks of gold and gray. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. He didn't know their names, didn't know where they lived, what school they went to, who their mother was. He didn't know why he had handed over that much money for a toy he didn't need. He didn't even know what he was hoping to find by following them. All he knew was this. When he looked at those two boys, sitting alone on that bench with eyes too tired for their age, he saw something that mirrored the emptiness he carried in himself, a reflection he hadn't seen in years. Maybe it was the way they held on to each other, or maybe it was the car, that damned little red car that had once belonged to Emily, his daughter, his only child. She had loved cars, not the fast, flashy kind, but the ones she could build herself. Wooden kits, simple designs. She'd paint them red because red goes faster. Daddy, and he'd nod, pretending to believe her logic. The one she kept close as her favorite looked just like the one those boys had, and she had died with it beside her. That memory came crashing down with such force it almost made him nauseous. The hospital, the sterile light, the sudden silence, after the beeping stopped, the way his wife collapsed into him, screaming. And then, nothing. Years of nothing. Of contracts and mergers. Of money without meaning. Of weeks that bled into months and ended in quarters. He hadn't let himself feel this in so long. But that little toy had cracked something wide open. The Bentley glided out of Central Park and into the city's more rugged arteries. Soon they were turning off the wide avenues and into smaller streets. The buildings grew shorter, the shops a little shabbier. Neon signs buzzed weakly over convenience stores. A group of teens huddled outside a laundromat. A man with a shopping cart sifted through a trash bin near the curb. Mr. Brooks shifted forward. "Where are we, Brooklyn, sir?" "Near Flatbush. Looks like they're heading into one of the side streets." He peered out the tinted window. The neighborhood had changed. Gone were the doorman and valet stands. Here, the paint peeled from the brick. Metal gates hung askew on storefronts. Garbage bags formed hills at the base of alleys. It was a different New York one he had spent a lifetime avoiding. But it was their New York. Tommy and Danny turned down a narrow alley. Their figures small in the distance. The Bentley couldn't follow without drawing attention. Charles eased the car to a stop. "They went in there," he said. "Should we?" Mr. Brooks opened the door without answering. The chill hit him immediately. A sharp, pungent air, thick with street oil and distant rot. He adjusted his scarf, clutching the toy car tighter, and stepped out. "I'll walk from here." Charles watched him disappear into the alley, mouth slightly open. This man, who once negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, was now walking into a neighborhood where locks were more for show than security. But he knew better than to stop him. Mr. Brooks walked quietly, careful not to step too loudly. The sounds of the alley echoed, voices arguing behind closed doors, a baby crying somewhere above, a TV blaring through a broken window. His polished shoes crunched over grit and glass. Then he saw them. The boys were outside a rusted steel door, fumbling with a set of keys. Tommy turned and gave his brother a look, a blend of worry and determination. Danny nodded and knocked gently, before unlocking the door. "Mama, we're home. We got help, Mama. We have the money for the medicine." No answer, only coughing. Wet, deep, labored coughing from within. Mr. Brooks stopped. The door had closed behind them, but the sounds carried through. He could hear Danny's panic, Tommy's trembling voice. He stepped closer. Every instinct told him to turn back. This wasn't his place, his world. But something rooted him to the ground, because for the first time in years, he wasn't just witnessing someone else's pain. He felt it. And in the echoes of two boys crying out for a mother who might not make it through the night. Jonathan Brooks remembered exactly what it meant to be human. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and called the one person he trusted most with a crisis. "Dr. Maxwell, it's Brooks. I'm bringing someone in. Get the ICU ready. No delays." He hung up, turned, and walked back to the car. The toy car still rested in his coat pocket, but the man holding it was not the same. And as the Bentley roared back to life and prepared to cut through the city night once more, the road ahead no longer looked like a route home. It looked like the start of something entirely new. The night pressed in around them, thick and cold, as the Bentley merged back into traffic. Inside the car, silence reigned. Mr. Jonathan Brooks sat motionless in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside, yet clearly seeing something far beyond the city lights. In his palm, he still held the red wooden toy, its edges worn smooth by time and touch. His fingers traced the curves unconsciously, as if trying to conjure something long buried through muscle memory alone. Charles, his driver, glanced at him. In the rearview mirror, he'd never seen Mr. Brooks like this, quiet. Yes, but never distant. Never lost. They turned down another block, the city beginning to thin into rows of smaller, older homes. A few flickering street lamps cast halos of orange over uneven sidewalks and leaning fences. The Bentley felt foreign here, too large, too polished, too quiet. But it rolled forward, obediently, gliding toward the shadows where the two small boys had disappeared. They went down that alley. Charles said quietly, "I think we're close." Mr. Brooks said nothing at first. His jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, like he was speaking more to himself than anyone else. "Pull over. I'll go the rest of the way on foot." Charles blinked, surprised again. "Sir, are you sure? This isn't exactly, I'm sure." The car slowed to a stop beside a chain-link fence tangled with dead vines. Mr. Brooks stepped out into the night, pulling his coat tighter around him, the toy car still cradled in one hand. The air here was different, heavy with cooking oil. an exhaust tinged with something sour and metallic. It was a smell he didn't recognize. Not because it was new, but because he had spent a lifetime avoiding it. He walked slowly, carefully, his expensive shoes crunching softly over grit and cigarette butts. Around him, the city moved like a dream. Shouts echoed in the distance. A siren wailed several blocks away. Somewhere above, a child laughed, followed by the sharp clatter of a pot hitting a floor. The alley narrowed, splitting into a crooked T, and then, he heard it, a child's voice, urgent, muffled, but panicked. "Mama, Mama, we got the money, Mama." Then coughing raw, wrenching, painful. Another child's voice, higher-pitched, crying, feet shuffling, a door creaking. Mr. Brooks stopped. He could see the doorway now, the rusted frame, the flickering light bulb overhead that threatened to burn out at any moment. The boys had gone inside. They hadn't seen him. He was still invisible, still just a shadow in their story. And yet, he felt tethered to that door, as though an invisible thread had hooked into his chest and pulled tight. His instinct, every instinct, told him to walk away. This wasn't his world. These weren't his problems. He'd done what was needed, more than what was needed. Money had changed hands. He had already gone further than most ever would, but money wasn't enough. Not this time. He had seen too much, felt too much, and he couldn't unsee the way Tommy's hands trembled when he took the cash. Couldn't unhear the way Danny had whispered, "What if no one helps us?" Like it was a prayer he was tired of repeating. Jonathan Brooks was not a man prone to irrational decisions. His entire fortune had been built on precision, logic, and unshakable control. He didn't believe in fate, or miracles, or emotional detours. Not anymore. But as he stood there, alone in the shadows, something stirred that had long been buried beneath years of grief and ambition. A memory not of the boardroom, or contracts, or accolades, but of small hands in his, of bedtime stories, of little footsteps echoing down hardwood floors. And then he remembered the hospital, the sterile smell, the weight of finality. He could still hear the flat line. His grip on the toy car tightened. Not out of anger, out of need. He turned back, strode quickly toward the car. "Charles," he said as he slid back in. "She's not going to make it through the night without help." "Who?" "Sir, the boy's mother. Call Dr. Maxwell. Tell him I'm bringing in an emergency patient. Have them prepare the ICU, full cardiac workup, respiratory support. I want the best team on call. And get the billing department out of the way, no questions asked." Charles, wide-eyed, began dialing. He didn't need further explanation. 10 minutes later, Mr. Brooks stood at the door to the apartment. He knocked twice. No answer. Then he pushed gently on. The door creaked open. What met him was not shocking in a dramatic sense. It wasn't squalid or grotesque. It was simply forgotten. Dim, thin walls, peeling wallpaper, a single space, heater struggling to warm the air. And in the middle of the room, on a thin mattress covered with mismatched blankets, lay a woman who looked more like a shadow than a person. Margaret. She was barely conscious. Her lips were blue at the corners. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic bursts. The boys were by her side, one holding her hand, the other crying into her shoulder. They looked up when they heard him. Tommy's eyes widened. Danny's mouth opened in surprise. Tommy whispered. Mr. Brooks didn't explain. He just stepped forward, kneeling beside the bed. He reached out and felt her forehead burning with fever. Her pulse, weak. Her breath, rattled. "She won't survive the night here," he said gently. "We have to move her, now." The boys looked at each other. Neither spoke. But neither objected. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Mr. Brooks wrapped Margaret in a coat. He carried her carefully, her weight nearly nothing, her warmth already fading. Down the stairs, through the alley, into the Bentley, where Charles held the door open with a stunned expression. Once inside, the car roared to life and surged forward through the night. In the back seat, Mr. Brooks cradled the woman against him, one hand gripping the toy car in his coat pocket, the other steadying her head as she coughed, barely awake. Tommy and Danny sat across from him, eyes wide, holding each other's hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. They said nothing, but they knew. Somehow, in this strangest silence, in the way he looked at their mother, in the way he had simply shown up and acted, they knew they weren't alone anymore. They didn't yet know where they were going, but it was the first time in a long, long while that it felt like they were finally going somewhere better. The city blurred outside. Streetlights flickered past like falling stars. And inside that moving sanctuary of steel and leather, 3 lives once divided by wealth, grief, and silence began to braid into one. And they were just getting started. The sirens weren't blaring, but they didn't have to be. The urgency sat thick in the air, as palpable as the fear pressing down on everyone in the back of the Bentley. The car sliced through late-night traffic like a bullet, guided by a driver who understood without asking that every second mattered now. Red lights were suggestions. Lanes didn't matter. Charles drove like a man on a mission. And in truth, he was. Because in the rear seat of that luxury vehicle, life and death were quietly grappling for control. Margaret lay slumped against Mr. Brooks, her body trembling in uneven waves. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, like the city's cold. Night air itself was too heavy for her lungs to carry. Her skin had taken on a worrying pallor, and her fingers were cold against the fabric of his coat. She didn't speak. She barely moved. Across from them, Tommy and Danny sat huddled together, knees drawn to their chests. Tommy's jaw was tight, trying not to cry. Danny wasn't even pretending. His face was pressed into his brother's arm, shaking with silent sobs that he tried to muffle against the leather seat. For children who had spent weeks pretending to be strong, the mask was now slipping cracked by fear and helplessness. Mr. Brooks didn't look at them, not directly, but his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, then back down to Margaret. He adjusted her head against his shoulder, gently, almost reverently. There was no trace now of the cold businessman, the untouchable mogul. There was only a man holding a dying woman, haunted by the memory of not getting there in time once before. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered it without hesitation. "Dr. Maxwell, we're ready," came the doctor's voice, steady and firm. Entrance. Team's been briefed. Private room is prepped. Cardiac monitors, respiratory support, full crash cart. We'll be there in less than 5, Brooks replied, and hung up. He didn't say it out loud, but his thoughts were spinning. He couldn't stop remembering how quickly it had happened with Emily. 1 minute she was fine laughing, painting a wooden truck, and the next, collapsed on the kitchen floor. A rare condition, they said. Inoperable. They had tried everything. But by the time she reached the hospital, there was nothing left to save. The thought clamped around his heart like a vice. He wasn't going to let it happen again. Not tonight. The city outside had changed. They were nearing the hospital district, now glass towers glowing like monoliths in the dark, haloed by ambulance lights and the quiet hum of infrastructure built to carry human suffering. Mount Sinai loomed ahead, modern and sharp-edged, its bright signage cutting through the skyline like a promise. The car jerked to a stop. The rear doors flew open before Charles could fully put the vehicle in park. Nurses in scrubs waited with a stretcher. Their expressions were practiced efficient. Professional, but even they flinched slightly at the sight of Jonathan Brooks, billionaire and CEO, stepping out of a car with a half-conscious woman cradled in his arms like a child. He didn't hesitate. "She's crashing," he said, placing Margaret gently on the stretcher. "Weak pulse. History of heart complications. Severe respiratory distress. Probably a mix of congestive failure and pneumonia. Move now." The nurse nodded, and the team sprang into action. Tommy and Danny scrambled after them, but a security guard gently blocked their path at the ER entrance. "Family only." "They are her family," Mr. Brooks said without looking back. "They stay with me." The guard stepped aside. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights seemed too harsh after the dimness of the alley and the warm dark of the Bentley. Everything smelled like antiseptic and fear. Machines beeped. Voices called out codes. Footsteps pounded on tile floors. It was a symphony of urgency, where emotions were shelved in favor of protocol. But fear still bled through the seams. Margaret was wheeled behind double doors. They swung shut. For a brief, heavy moment, everything was still. Tommy stood frozen. Danny clung to his coat. They were alone again, in a place they didn't understand. Surrounded by people they didn't know, watching the only person they had left being carried into the unknown. Then they turned, slowly, to look at Mr. Brooks. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. But the look in their eyes, fragile, pleading, exhausted, said everything. Don't let her die. And somehow, he understood. He reached into his coat pocket again and pressed the red toy car into Danny's hand. "Stay close to me," he said quietly. "She's in the best hands now." The hours that followed moved strangely slow, but charged. Mr. Brooks stayed in the waiting room with them, pacing at times, staring through the glass doors at others. Tommy dozed with his head on the armrest. Danny clutched the car like a lifeline. Mr. Brooks, for his part, didn't speak unless spoken to. He made calls, sent texts, barked out one or two curt instructions to Charles. But otherwise, he simply stayed. And it was the staying that mattered. Because for the first time since their mother had fallen ill, Tommy and Danny weren't alone. With their fear at 2:17 a.m., Dr. Maxwell emerged from behind the heavy double doors. His scrubs were damp with sweat, his mask pulled down around his neck. He looked tired, but he was smiling. "She's stable," he said, "on oxygen. Fever's breaking. We got her just in time." The boys stared at him in stunned silence. Mr. Brooks simply closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was something softer there. Less edge, more breath. "She needs a few days of monitoring," the doctor added, "but she's going to make it." Tommy's shoulders sagged. Danny sat down right there on the linoleum floor, gripping the toy car so tightly the wheels bent sideways. He started to cry again, but this time, the tears weren't born of fear. They were the tears that come when the worst doesn't happen. The kind that flood out because there's finally room to feel. Mr. Brooks crouched beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You saved her." Danny looked up, blinking. "No," he said. "You did." And Mr. Brooks didn't argue. Because, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man who had everything but had lost the only thing that mattered. He felt something else now. Something raw. Something unfinished. It wasn't over. Not yet. And somewhere, in the hum of the hospital monitors and the steady breathing of a mother who had been pulled back from the edge, something new was taking root. Something worth staying for. The hospital room was quiet. Monitors beeped in steady, reassuring rhythms, their soft lights casting a pale blue glow across the walls. Margaret lay resting peacefully, her chest rising and falling with calm, measured breaths. The chaos of the night before had faded into a hush of machines and recovery. Outside the room, in the long hallway of Mount Sinai's intensive care wing, Jonathan Brooks stood staring through the small pane of glass in the door. His posture was straight, but his eyes betrayed him. They were tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind worn into the soul over time. Next to him sat Tommy and Danny, curled up on a bench, too stiff for comfort, but too worn out to care. One of them had fallen asleep. The other kept glancing at the door, then back at Mr. Brooks, as if to check that everything was still real. He hadn't planned to stay this long. He hadn't planned any of it. The original idea had been simple. Help the boys, drop them off, vanish, do the decent thing, and move on. But something about last night had pulled him off course, and now, standing in that sterile hallway with the scent of antiseptic and something achingly human in the air, he couldn't bring himself to leave. A nurse passed by and nodded politely. He nodded back, but his mind wasn't there. It had been 10 years. 10 years since he'd stood in a hospital hallway, wearing a different suit, holding a different silence. 10 years since a doctor had walked out of those same double doors and shook his head. No heartbeat, no chance, no going back. Her name had been Emily. She was 7. The doctors had said it was a congenital heart defect, undiagnosed, cruel in its stealth. She had collapsed at the breakfast table, halfway through a bowl of strawberries and cream. His wife, Helen, had screamed. He had frozen. The paramedics came fast. The hospital did all they could, but it wasn't enough. The image of her small body lying still. The red toy car clutched in one hand, it was burned into him, unshakable. That car had stayed with him for years, untouched on a shelf in the room. He couldn't bear to enter, but one day he opened the door, walked in, and locked it behind him. Then he took the car, placed it in a small wooden box, and told himself it was time to move forward. Only, he never really did. His wife had lasted a year after that. She tried, but she was already half gone the day Emily died. When she left, it wasn't dramatic, it was just ... final. A quiet departure from a house that had forgotten how to be a home. He had filled the silence with meetings, with power, with glass towers, and bottom lines. People called him driven, brilliant, unstoppable, but he knew better. He wasn't building an empire, he was burying a past. Now, here he was again. Same hospital, different child, different mother. But the look in Tommy's eyes when he thought he might lose her, that was the same. The panic, the pleading, the helpless hope. Mr. Brooks had seen it once before, in the mirror, a lifetime ago. He rubbed his eyes and exhaled. Deeply. This wasn't charity anymore. This was something else. Charles arrived with 2 coffees and a bag of muffins. He said nothing, just handed one to Mr. Brooks, who took it with a small nod. The boys stirred slightly as the smell of warm bread filled the hallway. Danny sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes, blinking at the daylight that had started to spill through the windows. "Is Mom okay?" he asked, voice still hoarse with sleep. "She's still resting," Mr. Brooks replied gently. "Doctor says she's doing well. Very strong." Tommy sat up straighter. "Can we see her?" "In a bit," Mr. Brooks said. "Let her get a little stronger first." The boys nodded. They trusted him now, though neither of them could have explained why. Maybe it was the way he stood. Maybe it was the silence he carried, solid, dependable, like a wall behind them. Maybe it was just because he stayed. They ate quietly. Mr. Brooks didn't touch his muffin. Instead, he looked at the toy car now, sitting in Danny's lap. The red paint chipped, one of the wheels a little loose. It was worthless by any financial measure. But that tiny object had started something, had reached across a chasm, 10 years wide, and touched something in him that he thought was dead. He watched as Danny absent-mindedly ran his finger across the roof of the car. A memory returned uninvited. Amelie, doing the same thing on the floor of his office while he took a phone call, mouthing the sound of a car engine under her breath. He hadn't looked up then, hadn't realized it was the last time he'd ever hear her do that. He looked away. "You boys have somewhere to stay?" he asked suddenly, the question catching even himself off guard. Tommy glanced up. "Our apartment, I guess. But we can't stay there alone. And we can't leave Mom." Mr. Brooks nodded slowly. His mind was already working not with spreadsheets or contracts, but with something new, with logistics of care, with responsibility, with the fragile truth that life had thrown them into his path, and that walking away would now take more effort than staying. He stood and checked his watch. "You'll come with me," he said quietly, "at least until your mother's better." Danny looked startled. "To your house?" Mr. Brooks gave a slow nod. "There's space. Someone to take care of you. You'll be safe. It's just for now." The boys exchanged a glance. They were too young to understand how extraordinary the offer was, too young to calculate the implications, but they weren't too young to know what it felt like to need someone. And for someone to say yes. Tommy spoke for both of them. "Okay." Mr. Brooks turned toward the hallway, signaling Charles with a small wave. They'd need to call Mrs. Jenkins, his longtime housekeeper. They'd need beds made, rooms opened, clothes bought, everything arranged. But for now, none of that mattered. As they walked toward the elevator, the toy car still clutched in Danny's hand, the morning sun finally spilled fully through the window's warm, bright, and golden dot, and as the doors closed, behind them, for the first time in a decade, Jonathan Brooks didn't feel like he was leaving a hospital. He felt like he was taking a step home. The black Bentley pulled into the private driveway just as the morning fog began to lift. The wrought iron gates had swung open at Charles's signal, revealing the full facade of the Brooks estate, 3 stories of stone and glass perched on the Hudson, where the city's noise gave way to the hush of wealth and space. For most, it would have looked like paradise. But to Tommy and Danny, it felt more like a museum, quiet, intimidating. Too big. The boys sat stiffly in the back seat, their eyes darting from the tall hedges to the massive front door, carved from dark oak and framed by 2 silent lion statues. It looked like the kind of place where you weren't supposed to speak above a whisper. Mr. Brooks stepped out first, buttoning his coat as Charles retrieved the boys' small bags, tattered, nearly empty, carrying more worry than belongings. The brothers followed, staying close together, their sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble entryway. Inside, the house opened into a grand foyer, sunlight spilling through cathedral windows and catching dust motes in midair like tiny stars. A sweeping staircase climbed up in a curve. The floors gleamed. The walls were lined with art they didn't recognize, silent portraits, abstract paintings, all distant and expensive. It was beautiful and lonely. Mrs. Jenkins was the first familiar face they saw. She had worked for Mr. Brooks for over 20 years, and though she wore her hair tight in a bun and kept her words measured, her presence radiated the warmth of an old fireplace in winter. She took one look at the boys' clothes, rumpled eyes wide, clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors, and softened. "You must be Tommy and Danny," she said, crouching slightly, voice low and kind. "We've got rooms ready upstairs, and breakfast waiting in the kitchen. Come, now, you've had quite the night." The boys didn't move until Mr. Brooks gave a small nod. Then they followed her down a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon polish and something warm from the oven. Mr. Brooks stood alone in the entryway for a moment longer. The silence here was different from the hospital's. It was curated, polished, a silence that came from years of speaking only when necessary. But now, it felt too quiet, unnatural, as though the air was holding its breath. Later that morning, he passed by the open kitchen door and paused. The boys were seated at the large wooden table, plates in front of them. Danny was already eating noisily while Tommy watched. Still guarded, Mrs. Jenkins poured juice into glasses and offered a soft chuckle as Danny attempted to pronounce quiche with comic seriousness. Mr. Brooks didn't step in, he simply watched. There was something surreal about seeing children at that table again. He remembered the sound of Emily's laughter echoing off these very walls. Her cereal bowl would always be a mess, her napkin always forgotten. But her joy had filled every corner of this house. After she died, so did the noise. Rooms were closed off, toys stored in boxes, curtains drawn tighter. Now, the house was beginning to breathe again. Over the following days, the boys adjusted slowly, like stray cats, learning not to flinch at every shadow. Danny was quicker to explore, drawn to everything unfamiliar, especially the spiral staircase and the garden maze. He would ask 100 questions before lunch and lose focus halfway through the answer. Tommy was more cautious. He didn't speak unless prompted. He never sat with his back to a room. But even he began to relax when Mrs. Jenkins taught him how to use the espresso machine's milk frother to make hot chocolate. She winked and said it was their secret recipe. They attended school online while their mother recovered. A private tutor came 3 times a week, assigned discreetly by Mr. Brooks, without asking permission, only ensuring the tutor was kind. He didn't want the boys feeling tested. He only wanted them to feel normal. At night, the house changed. It became softer. Mr. Brooks would pass by the study and hear faint giggles. One night, he stepped closer and saw through the cracked door the boys on the floor, building towers from old books and using chess pieces as knights and dragons. He didn't interrupt. He stood there, unmoving, as the smile he didn't know he still had began to stir at the corners of his mouth. He remembered that sound. Laughter, not the kind that performs, but the kind that simply happens. He hadn't heard it here in years. It unsettled him and warmed him in equal measure. One evening, Mrs. Jenkins found a note in the kitchen: leave dinner on the warmer. Meeting ran late, but when she brought the boys their meals to the den, she found Mr. Brooks already there, sitting on the floor, jacket off, tie loosened. Danny was showing him a drawing of their mother in the hospital bed, surrounded by stars. It's where angels are, Danny explained, but she didn't go with them. She came back. Mr. Brooks didn't speak, but he nodded, and very gently, he placed the drawing on the mantel, next to a photo of Emily that had sat alone for a decade. No one mentioned it, but something shifted that night. The next day, he asked Mrs. Jenkins to prepare a second breakfast plate, even though he hadn't eaten in the kitchen since his wife left. The morning after that, he drove the boys to the hospital himself, and by the end of the week, he'd installed a set of nightlights in each of their rooms without a word. After hearing Danny whimper in his sleep, the house, once built to keep people out, was changing brick by brick, breath by breath. And in the echoes of tiny footsteps on marble, in the clatter of mismatched forks at breakfast, in the whisper of bedtime prayers spoken just down the hall, a new sound had returned, not loud, but steady. Laughter, woven into silence, and the silence no longer felt so lonely. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon when it happened, the kind of rain that didn't scream or flood, just quietly soaked everything in silence. The kind that made a large house feel even larger. Mr. Brooks had been in his study, sifting through financial reports out of habit more than interest. The rain tapped at the windows like a metronome. Predictable, background noise. In the den down the hall, Tommy and Danny were playing. The room had slowly become theirs over the past 2 weeks. Books stacked like castles, pillows strewn like battlefield debris, and a small stack of crayon drawings, now taped gently to the far wall. Mrs. Jenkins let them be. She'd once asked Mr. Brooks if she should rein them in, keep things respectable. He had surprised them both by saying, let them be kids. And so they were. Tommy was building a tall tower from wooden blocks, scavenged from an old chess set. Danny was searching for something to top it off. We need a flag, he'd said. Something royal. He glanced toward the shelf. It had always been off limits, even though no one had said so. The shelf was neat, curated an arrangement of framed photographs and small, untouchable objects. At the center was a single silver frame. In it, a girl about 7, smiling with her eyes closed. Caught mid-laugh, sunlight splashed across her freckled cheeks. Emily. Danny didn't know her name. He only knew it was the picture Mr. Brooks always looked at when he thought no one was watching. He reached for the frame, not to touch, just to look. His hand brushed the edge. One block from Tommy's tower fell with a soft click. Then another. Then the crash was quiet, as far as crashes go. The sound of glass on marble. Soft. Sharp. Final. The frame lay face down on the floor. The glass had cracked diagonally, a thin white fracture slicing across the image like a scar. Danny froze. Tommy turned first and gasped, reaching instinctively to pick it up, but it was too late. Mr. Brooks stood in the doorway. His face didn't contort. He didn't yell. But the silence that followed was worse than shouting. His eyes locked onto the frame, then to Danny, then Tommy. His jaw clenched once. Hard. His hands trembled just, barely but enough to betray the storm rising underneath. Tommy spoke quickly, panicked. "We didn't mean to. We were just playing. We didn't think it would fall." Mr. Brooks didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, picked up the frame gently with both hands, as if afraid to make the crack worse, and stared at it. Emily's smile looked distorted through the broken glass. He stood like that for a long, unbearable second. Then his voice low, steady, colder than the rain outside. "This room is not a playground." Danny's eyes welled up. He took a step back, one hand reaching for Tommy's. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. I just wanted it to be part of the castle." Mr. Brooks closed his eyes. Something flickered across his face. Grief, rage, guilt, all tangled together. His voice sharpened. "You don't touch things that aren't yours. Ever." Danny's lip trembled. Tommy stepped in front of him like a shield. "We'll fix it," Tommy said quickly. "We'll fix the picture. We didn't know." Mr. Brooks turned away, walking toward the fireplace, frame still in hand. "No," he said. "You didn't." The boy stood there, frozen, as the storm outside deepened. Mrs. Jenkins appeared a moment later. Having heard enough to know something had cracked, far beyond the photo, she didn't say anything. Just gave Mr. Brooks a look measured, knowing, and gently guided the boys from the room. Later that evening, the house returned to silence. But it was a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful hush of healing. A hollow, echoing quiet, the kind that settles in when words should have been said but weren't. In their guest room, Danny cried into his pillow. Tommy lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through memories like a Rolodex, searching for when things had changed. Just yesterday, Mr. Brooks had helped Danny fix a toy robot. Just this morning, he had smiled at their pancake faces drawn in syrup. But now, that man was gone. Downstairs, Mr. Brooks sat in his study with a whiskey glass, untouched, beside him. The silver frame lay on the desk, its crack illuminated by the desk lamp. He hadn't replaced the glass, hadn't moved the picture. He just kept staring. The boys hadn't broken the frame. Not really. What they had done, what Danny had done, with his small, curious hands, was open a door that had remained tightly shut for a decade. That photo, cracked, was the last pristine memory he'd kept untouched. Everything else, his home, his marriage, his joy, had long since fractured. But that smile, that frozen image of Emily, had remained whole. Until now. He didn't hate the boys. He hated the reminder, because for the first time, he wasn't in control of the grief anymore. It was in the open now, bleeding across the walls of a house that had finally begun to feel alive again, and it terrified him. Upstairs, Danny turned to Tommy and whispered, "I think he doesn't want us here anymore." Tommy said nothing. He was thinking the same thing. But deep in the marrow of the house, beneath the wood and stone and years of silence, something else stirred. Because sometimes, the worst cracks don't break things apart. They let the light in. And in the days that followed, that light would begin to shift everything. The house had returned to its old self. Not in furniture or sound, but in weight. That heavy stillness, the kind that doesn't just fill a room, but presses against your ribs, had crept back in, so quietly that no one dared name it. Laughter had stopped. Footsteps became softer. Doors closed more carefully. No one said anything about the picture frame. No one talked about what happened in the den. But the energy had shifted. And children always feel the shift before adults admit it's there. Tommy and Danny stayed mostly upstairs now. Meals were quieter. Danny, once the louder of the two, barely spoke. Tommy answered with nods. Nothing more. Their backpacks, always left by the kitchen door before, were now neatly tucked beside their guest room bed, as if preparing for a return to somewhere they hadn't yet named, but sensed was coming. Mr. Brooks noticed it all. He noticed The absence of crayon drawings on the refrigerator. Noticed that the hot chocolate machine hadn't been touched in 3 days. He even noticed that Mrs. Jenkins didn't hum while she cooked anymore. But he said nothing. It was easier, in a way. The boys stayed out of sight. The memories stayed boxed. The pain stayed manageable, only it wasn't. The frame still sat cracked on his desk. He hadn't fixed it. He hadn't thrown it away. He just left it there untouched. Like a wound he couldn't decide whether to clean or keep. He tried to work, but found himself rereading the same page of a report for over an hour. Numbers didn't make sense when the silence around them was screaming. On the 4th evening, Mrs. Jenkins found him by the fireplace. The room was dim. He wasn't drinking, just staring again. The same posture, the same breath held in his chest. She stood there a long moment before speaking. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Sir, they're just children." He didn't respond. "They didn't know," she continued. "They didn't mean harm. You scared them. More than you realize." He turned his head slightly. "It was a boundary," he said. "They crossed it." "No," she replied softly. Walking closer, "They touched something you buried." He stiffened. "Emily's picture didn't break the house," she added. "Your silence did." The words sat there, suspended between them like dust in light. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She'd worked beside him long enough to know how loss made its home inside a person. But she also knew when pain became a shield and when it turned into a wall. He exhaled through his nose and looked back at the fire. "I didn't mean to yell," he said at last. "I wasn't angry at them." "I know," she said. "But they don't." She left him there, her footsteps soft, the echo fading as the weight of her words settled deep. That night, he couldn't sleep. He wandered the house like a man searching for something he'd misplaced. Every room he passed whispered memories. Emily's old playroom. The hallway where she once danced in socks. The staircase she used to race up 2 steps at a time. Finally, he stopped outside the boy's door. The light underneath was still on. He knocked once, gently. No answer. Inside, Danny was pretending to sleep. Curled beneath the blanket with the toy car held tight to his chest. Tommy sat by the window, arms folded on the sill, staring out at the moonlight. Mr. Brooks stood in the hallway a moment longer, hand resting on the doorknob, but he didn't turn it. He could, single quotes. He wanted to say "I'm sorry," but the words lodged in his throat, shaped by a decade of not speaking them. Not to Helen, not to himself, and not to the daughter whose laugh still lived in the cracks of these walls. He stepped back, quietly, walked down the hallway, then stopped. There, hanging crooked on the wall, was one of Danny's drawings. A simple one. Stick figures, 2 boys, 1 woman, and a man standing under a roof. In the man's hand, a small red square. The card above them, in shaky handwriting, 1 word, safe. He stared at it for a long moment. The next morning, the house felt different. Not warm, not yet, but lighter. Because somewhere in the space between silence and speech, between memory and forgiveness, something had begun to thaw. And tomorrow, for the first time, he would finally let himself speak the words he should have said long ago, not for absolution, but for healing. Because even when apologies go unspoken, the heart still hears them. Spring came early that year. The first warm breeze drifted in through the open windows of Margaret's hospital room, carrying the faint scent of cherry blossoms from the street below. She sat propped up against crisp, white pillows, her face still pale but no longer ghost-like. There was color in her cheeks again, light in her eyes, and when she smiled, truly smiled, it was as if time had turned back, even if only for a moment. Across from her, Tommy and Danny sat side by side, feet swinging off the edge of the visitor's bench, each with a paper cup of apple juice in hand. Danny had drawn a crayon rainbow on the paper cup sleeve. Tommy had written her name in careful block letters. Mr. Brooks stood near the window. He hadn't planned to come that day, but somehow, each day since the incident with the picture frame, his steps had carried him back here, quietly, as if pulled by something that didn't require permission. Margaret looked at him with calm gratitude, kind of look that needed no words. He met her gaze for a moment, then looked out the window. The trees were blooming again, slowly. "I think they're ready," she said softly, not breaking eye contact. He turned to her. "For what? To go home?" The word lingered. He hesitated. "Your apartment. It's still under repair." "The landlord." "I'm not talking about the apartment," she said gently. The boys looked up, confused. Mr. Brooks stayed still, his hand resting on the edge of the window. She continued. "You gave them something I couldn't. Not just a roof. Safety, space, and for a while, a place to breathe. But it's time they come back to me. To what's real, I need them. And they need to see I'm strong again. Not perfect, not wealthy, just theirs. He nodded slowly. There was no objection in his heart. But there was something else. A quiet ache. He'd gotten used to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Laughter from the den. Crayons scattered across the kitchen table. He'd gotten used to life happening again. More than that, he'd begun to need it. They've changed me, he admitted. The word surprised even him. Margaret's smile softened. They do that. He looked over at them, Danny, waving his juice cup in small victory over finishing his crossword puzzle. Tommy explaining how the hospital bed worked like a robot. The simplicity of it all. The way their presence filled a room without trying. It had rewired something inside him. Something that had been broken for a long time. I was a stranger when they walked into my life, he said. And somehow, they made me feel less alone. Margaret didn't rush to respond. She looked at her sons, then back to him. I think that's what family does, she said quietly. Even if it starts by accident. They didn't call it goodbye when discharge day came. No one said the word. It hung there, unspoken, carried in the way Mrs. Jenkins lingered too long over packing snacks. Or how Charles offered to drive them just to the corner, and ended up carrying the bags inside. Even the boys seemed to understand that something was ending, but not in a sad way. More like a book whose last page had finally been earned. As they stood at the door, ready to leave, Danny looked up at Mr. Brooks. Do we still get to visit? Mr. Brooks knelt down. Every Sunday you choose the time. I'll make pancakes. Danny grinned. Tommy nodded solemnly, already trying not to cry. Margaret stepped forward and extended her hand. But instead of shaking it, Mr. Brooks pulled her into a gentle hug. There was a hesitation at first, then a stillness. Then something that felt like release. When they pulled apart, nothing more needed to be said. The door closed behind them. The house felt quiet again, but not empty. He walked back into the den. On the mantel, beside the newly repaired photo of Emily, stood a new edition, a crayon drawing, in Danny's bold handwriting. Thank you, Mr. B. You helped us save Mum. Underneath, stick figures again, now with a dog, and a tree, and a sun with sunglasses. He didn't cry, but he sat with the drawing for a long time. The house would remain large and quiet. The routines would return. The world of finance and meetings would resume. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. Because in the space where silence had once ruled, there was now something steadier, a place where laughter had echoed, and might echo again. And deep in the bones of the house, the echo lingered. The following Sunday arrived with sunlight pouring through the windows, like an old friend finally returning. The Brooks estate, though still quiet, felt different, less like a monument to solitude, and more like a place waiting for footsteps. Mr. Brooks was in the kitchen. No one else, no staff, no Mrs. Jenkins humming a tune. Just him, sleeves rolled, whisk in hand, trying to remember if the recipe called for buttermilk, or if he'd made that part up. The batter wasn't perfect too. Lumpy, but he didn't mind. It was real. That was enough. He glanced at the clock. 10:30. Tommy and Danny were supposed to arrive at 11. Pancakes were their idea. With chocolate chips, Danny had insisted. And syrup that comes in the glass bottle, not the plastic kind. He'd ordered 3 kinds, just in case. The kitchen was warm, the smell of vanilla rising from the stove. He moved slower these days. Not out of age, but out of intention. Each moment had begun to carry a weight, a purpose, and that weight, though new, felt good-earned. By 11:15, they still hadn't arrived. He wiped his hands on a towel, glanced out the tall front window, then back at the empty dining table set with mismatched placemats. Something in his chest tightened. They weren't coming. He wasn't sure how he knew. He just did. The phone rang. It was Margaret. Her voice was kind, gentle, practiced. She apologized for not calling sooner, said she'd meant to, but the week had been heavy. Tommy started at the new school, she said. Danny's seeing a counselor, just to help process everything. I think he misses the house more than he admits. There was a pause. He drew you again yesterday, she added. Stick figure in a suit, big smile, holding a pancake. Mr. Brooks let out a small laugh that surprised them both. I hope you're doing okay, she said, her voice suddenly more personal. I know it's been quiet. He didn't lie. It's different, he said. I miss them. Then she said something he hadn't expected. You don't have to. The words hung in the air. He didn't answer right away. Margaret filled the silence. They talk about you every day. Not just because you helped save me, but because you saw them. Really saw them. And that doesn't happen often. Not to kids like mine. Mr. Brooks closed his eyes, hand resting on the counter. The cooling scent of pancakes filling the room. I didn't just see them, he said softly. They brought me back. Another pause. This one quieter. I know, she said. I want to do more, he continued. Not out of guilt, not as charity. He stopped, searching for the right shape of the thought. I want to stay part of their lives. Not just as the man who paid a hospital bill, but someone who belongs in their future. Margaret didn't respond immediately, and he didn't press her. Finally, she spoke. Then don't ask, she said. Just show up. And so he did. Not with grand gestures. Not with money, with presents. He attended Danny's school play even when Danny only had 2 lines. He helped Tommy fix a bicycle tire, and didn't mind when they got grease on his sweater. He visited their tiny apartment on Wednesdays for dinner, sat on the floor when there weren't enough chairs, and listened to Margaret talk about her new job at the clinic. He became part of the background, not the center, not a savior. Just steady. The boys stopped calling him Mr. Brooks sometime in the fall. One day, he was just John. And when Christmas came, they didn't ask for toys. They asked if he'd come early, to help make the tree not lean to the left like last year. He laughed. He said yes, because sometimes the greatest acts aren't born out of obligation or image. They come from a place deeper where kindness meets courage, where grief is not erased but transformed, and where love chooses to return, even when it has every reason to stay away. On a shelf in his study, beside the photo of Emily now carefully reframed, sits another picture. Danny and Tommy at the kitchen table. Chocolate-smeared smiles, holding up burnt pancakes, like trophies, in his eyes. They're all his family now, not by blood, but by choice. A choice beyond charity. A choice to love again.